So please join me in welcoming Dr. David Millhouse.
Well, good morning. I don't know how we get on to the next set of slides, but I've got really two topics in this session. One is an update on the law, which includes the quality of advice review, but also how then we deal with it using what is a rapidly moving technological feast. So I'll start with the law first, and I've deliberately called this More Law and More Confusion, because that's exactly what we see. So that slide there shows you on the right-hand slide, right-hand part of the slide, the Corporations Act as it was in 2018 when I finished my PhD. On the left is the Corporations Act as of the 30th of December 2023. And in addition to that are the legislative instruments, which are another 400,000 or so words. So I should just say that that's written on much thinner paper, and that's you can't buy this anywhere. You've got to go and buy these things online from Amazon or somewhere, at huge expense. But the volume of legislation continues to be accretive in terms of these statutes, and of course that doesn't include the ASIC Act or the APRA Act or any of the other bits of legislation I'll talk about in a minute. Now, these are the word volumes that we are all supposed to know. So in total, it amounts to 3 million words in the Corporations Act alone, and growing. So in more recent times, these are the issues that the government have been attending to, and with support or otherwise from the Law Reform Commission. So the first one is this document called Confronting Complexity, which is nearly 400 pages long. And I'm going to quote from the DDO obligations in a minute, but I quote, "Treasury has previously identified a high level of prescription in financial services legislation. But overseas, and you've got to go to page 230 to find this, in other jurisdictions there's a trend towards principle-based law, which I want to come to in a minute. So on the one hand, you've got people saying that we need principle-based law, but on the other hand, you've got this statutory accretion, which occurs across every element of what you good people do. And that leads me to the Michelle Levy report, which is reported as delivering better financial outcomes. And this, in my view, is a classic case of confusion in the law, driven largely by vested interest. And again, this hasn't yet been legislated, but when it is, it'll be a pig's ear, I suspect. And it talks about creating a new class of advisor, which is clearly driven by the banks, with a lesser standard of education and quality and all sorts of things, and not charging fees, which is obviously going to be part of the product selling exercise from financial institutions. It also talks about best interest. Now, just for context, there are, in Australian law today, 18 different interpretations of best interest. And what this review talks about is bringing a new definition of best interest, which is yet to be defined, and of course yet to be adjudicated into the law. It also talks about having principles based in this legislation, but if you dig into the details, the principles are actually administrative principles, and they're not legal principles. So on the one hand, and it interfaces with the FASEA, or the former FASEA ethics standards things, it talks about principles and so on, but it never actually defines what these legal principles are. And nowhere in any of this new law, going back to the days of FASEA, is there any recognition of the value of the fiduciary relationship. You don't see it anywhere as a noun or a verb or an adjective, anywhere. So this delivering better financial outcomes thing, as I say, it's yet to be legislated, but it's likely not to add much value. And for your own good selves, it actually has one damaging or potentially for an advisor, damaging quality in the sense that they've abolished the safe harbour provision, which was the old Corporations Act 962B1A. So, and that is consistent, I'd have to say, with other most like jurisdictions, but there won't be in the Corporations Act the safe harbour provision that you've had hitherto. So all I can say on this whole levy thing is that it's been driven by vested interest. It's going to create more confusion and certainly more law, and we don't know how that's going to play out until we see the legislation. Now, recently there's been this whole furor about who is a sophisticated investor. And of course, as you'd all know, a lot of investment comes in the private capital market, at least, from family trusts and high net worth individuals and SMSFs and the like. So, and this proposed reform or regression, in my view, comes on top of the unrealised taxation of capital gains in super. And the combination of those is likely to knock out a lot of the private capital financing in things like managed investment schemes and the like. Now, I've actually written, at the invitation of Senators Bragg and Scarr, a submission to their Senate inquiry about this whole issue. And what they don't realise is that there are already 4 different layers of who's who in the zoo when it comes to these sorts of issues. So you've got the traditional dichotomy between a retail and a wholesale investor. You've then got professional and sophisticated investors. The FASIA standard brings that into a comprehension test. And then you've got these design and distribution obligations, which have a completely different interpretation of who's who. And in fact, it's dangerous in the sense that they confuse retail investor with financial consumer. And they use those 2 terms interrelatedly in the legislation and in the explanatory memorandum. So arguably, everybody in Australia is a financial consumer. And that legislation applies to every financial product that is sold by anybody in this country to an Australian resident. So again, confronting complexity looked at that issue. And I quote, "The DDO regime is an example of how legislative complexity can obscure policy objectives and key obligations. It is unnecessarily complex, principally owing to the bespoke definition of financial product." So that, ladies and gentlemen, is confronting complexity. And you can expect the Corporations Act to grow as a result. So these are all a moving feast. And just as a note of warning, whilst FASIA of itself has been abolished, and I hope that my article in Monday Morning had something to do with it, the standards still exist. So there's a new section 921E in the Corporations Act, and all it does is empower the minister to do what he likes, or she likes, in terms of the standard of ethics and so on, code of ethics and standards. And that is all now in its own legislative instrument, which you can download from the internet. But all of those obligations exist, and including the lifelong liability for the provision of advice. So it sort of parallels the abolition of the safe harbour regime in the Corporations Act. So this is honestly a real moving feast, and I spend at least an hour a day keeping up with the changes of the law. So next time we have a conference, I'm sure that we'll have the new legislation on terms of the levy review, etc. And we'll then be able to have a look at it. So the question then becomes is how do we handle this volume of information? And the first, from an advisor's perspective, this chart actually came directly out of my PhD. And I was very interested as to how in Australia we could end up with the situation where we have all this egregious behaviour, which continues, by the way, in financial services and financial product selling. So this is an empirical analysis. It's the only analysis that's ever been done in Australia. And the sample was quite large. It was, I looked for, these are all derived from senior court judgments over many years. And I was looking for empirical data. So the data set of nearly 400 cases, there was 199 where I could extract empirical data. And these are correlations both on a top decile and a top quartile basis across a number of variables, and then looking at the underlying systemic causes, both on a first variable and a second variable correlation. And you can see if you go to the right-hand column, the correlations are very, very, very tight. And so tight that it's always tempting to say there's causation. Now, I have a second database, which is nearly 500 cases, post-2018, and exactly the same patterns are emerging. So when I can afford a research assistant for a year, I'll write that up and make the argument that it's causation. And if you look at what is common in the left-hand column, it's related party transactions. And they are always at the cause of conflicts of interest, conflicts of duties, breaches of duty, directors and trustees, right? So as advisors, if you're selling a financial product, the first thing I would always go to is, are there any related parties involved? Because I can guarantee if you look right down in the bottom corner, there's a 100% correlation with breaches of duty. So when we're looking at then applying technology to all of this stuff, what we can do is to look for key words, and that would be one of them, key phrases. First thing we would look at. So that leads me then to what's been happening in the media a bit, and you can see the first few dot points. You all have seen this stuff in the financial press, and there's just bungle after bungle after bungle, and it's a bit like, you know, the minister seems to believe whoever's in his door last. You know, whichever way the wind blows, that's the way it goes. So, but going down to the fourth point gets us more into the technological side of this. And not only have we got legal buyer bewares, but we've got a lot of technological buyer bewares. So what you hear and see in the media and what you know, maybe talk about around the kitchen table sometimes with youngsters is that there's a lot of hype and not a lot of quality. So to the extent now that in the United States, people are banning the use of this ChatGPT stuff inside their organisations. Now, what you don't see very much in the Australian media is what's been happening in the United States with these actions, which are huge class actions. And that link that I've got on the bottom there, which I can email anyone that would like it, is a global webcast that I did about a month ago on this issue. So, and the cases in particular were the people of the United States, and separately an action which is the children of the United States, that's anyone under 16, v. OpenAI and Microsoft. And that was all about unjust enrichment and the theft of property from people's laptops and devices and mobile phones, etc. So huge actions, but basically what those organisations have done is scrape everybody's data that they can get hold of. And the last case there, Elon Musk versus OpenAI, he obviously wants to get what OpenAI have got. And that's, again, a very, very large case that's happening. So we haven't seen much about that in Australia, but when we're starting to talk about the application of technology, these are the sort of things that's happening in the background. So I should introduce at this point my colleague Nate, who's over there. The late Nate has spent 20 years on this, and he's the leader of ActiumAI's artificial intelligence initiatives. And Dr. Alan Thompson on our advisory board has come up with this diagram. So this shows you the global footprint of what are called large language models. So this is what people call AI. Now, the first thing to understand is that there's no such thing on the planet as artificial intelligence. There is no sentient human intelligence in any of these models. What these models are ever-growing, stochastic, probabilistic models. And people often ask me, how many lines of code do they have? And that's actually the wrong question to ask. And the growth in these models is driven by a process called vectorization, which is quite simple. It's the relationship between an XY coordinate on some data set, or an AB coordinate. That's what they are. And because of the computing power behind them and the electricity behind them, they can process huge numbers of these coordinates extremely quickly. So back in 2022, when we had a conference down at Bond University, and it was the launch of ChatGPT-3. You know, it had less than 20 billion of these parameters, as they're called, these XYZ relationships. Now you're getting into the trillions of parameters. And it's the number of parameters and the processing power that sits behind them and the electricity consumption that sits behind them that gives the impression that these things are intelligent. They're not. So what do we then do? Now, this is an example that you've probably heard of about OpenAI claiming that their machinery is better than humans when it comes to sitting the California bar exam. And in fact, that's a highly distorted interpretation. And the conclusion of the independent analysis is that this gives people false confidence. And you're seeing a lot of false confidence here in Australia when people are starting to use what these generative transform models are in terms of their outcome. And so the first insight is that they're not intelligent. The second insight is that none of these should ever be used in professional life without skilled human supervision. And this is the reason, is false confidence. So Nate, about a year ago, drafted this chart. And this, on one page, is the global infrastructure of artificial intelligence. So it's split into 3 zones. So zone 1 are these large language model providers, which I showed you on the planet chart. And these are highly capital intensive, hugely researched organizations like OpenAI and all of the big players that we've got there. Now, zone 2 are all the platforms, including platforms that you would all use, I'm sure. And I use LexisNexis, for instance, or you'd use Morningstar or whatever, Bloomberg, or what happens to be. They are using the technology in the background, largely on a white label basis, to give them more processing power and an ability to say publicly they're using artificial intelligence. Zone 3, at a client level, is the most important zone of all, because anyone can look, you know, you can always log into one of these models or whatever, or one of these platforms. But zone 3 is the client level contextual data sets and applications. So every context that anybody has, whether they're in the law or wealth management or whatever, is heavily contextual. And that's where zone 3 picks in. Now, we have built a global database on who's doing what in technology around the planet. So if someone wants XYZ application or agents, as they're called, we can plug that in. So where we fit in as Actium is that we integrate all of these things at the client contextual level. Now, insight number 3 is that anything that you send to OpenAI or any of these large language models is not going to be kept private. Right? So what we do is what they do is scrape all of the public data sets or whatever they can thieve that's generally assumed to be private. What we do in the integration of all of this is do it contextually with your own private data, and we don't send it to the cloud. What you have, in fact, you go back to the days of you having your own server room and it's actually keep it in-house, and more on that in a minute. So that is what's happening around the world. It changes daily, I can assure you, and keeping up with it is as hard as keeping up with the law. Now, we've done a case study on this, and using my own book, or chapter 1 of it, and we did it live last year at Bond University in Brisbane with a colleague of ours, Greg Hamrat, and Nate. Greg's in Silicon Valley. And what we did is using it real live in front of an audience, which included actually the chair of the New South Wales Bar, on analysing chapter 1. And on your handouts, there's this document. So there are 2 loose pages and then a set of questions. So what we asked the model, what we asked the robots to do, was to identify and create a format for a boardroom meeting agenda. So it analysed chapter 1 of the book and created this agenda from it. On the second page, you then see the minutes that came out of the meeting in terms of analysing the statutory framework, and the staple pages were the questions that were asked of the robot. Now, if you go to page 3, sorry, the last page, you can see that the average result from that, when it was checked by human, was 9 out of 10. So that, in my view, is a professionally acceptable result, using a robot to analyse a legal text. And you can do this, I mean, you could say, you could ask the robot to do anything that you want, including advice or whatever. And when you're dealing with these mounds of documents, as I showed you in the Corporations Act alone, we can read the Corporations Act and all of the other legislation and access the relevant case law and produce these sorts of outputs. Now that can be done today. So implementing that takes getting your head around a bit, but these things are happening right now here in Australia.
David, can I interject there? It read 30 pages of a dense legal textbook in 2 seconds and answered it in 2 seconds.
Yeah.
A professional lawyer took 10 hours. The 9 out of 10.
Yeah. Can I come back to that? Because now the question is, with all of this stuff, the technology is intellectually fascinating. There's no question. It's far more interesting than the law. Well, I've got a PhD in law, but how do you make profit from it? All right, and everybody asks me that question because you're all running your own businesses, your own practices, and there's nothing unusual, obviously, about that. But there are 3 elements to this. One is that there are very, very serious productivity gains to be had throughout your employee or labour base, and that applies to paralegals or administrative assistants as well as it does to partners and professionals. So, and the productivity gains are very contextual. So we use these numbers 400 to 545 times, and the upper bar limit was a case that Nate ran in anti-money laundering case actually. But there are lots of productivity gains to be had, and there are lots of cost minimisation activities that you can achieve, not just in your labour base, but also in the abuse or misuse of these large language models. Now, what's happening in some of the large law firms is that the youngsters are running riot with upload and download charges, and we have a solution to that issue. There are also gains to be made in human resources risks of various forms, over and above the productivity gains, but most importantly, the value proposition of a professional firm has actually been going down, in the sense that lots of professionals spend our lives in an office or whatever doing what we do. But at the end of the day, we sell the practice for one-time fees or something, What digitisation does is create a valuable asset, which is an investment asset. So it makes the shareholder value proposition much more substantial than a professional business just selling time. Now, the way we handle this is that all of those large language models that I showed you on the planet chart are all these probabilistic models. And they, to a large extent, because they're so restricted in the data sets that they can access, unless you give them your data, are garbage in, garbage out. And you see lots of stuff that is produced by ChatGPT or whatever it is that's complete garbage. And it might be okay to write a bit of local advertising copy, but it's not okay for professional work. And the distinction between what we do is apply these legal linguistics model that Nate's developed, both pre and post the processing side of it. So what the legal linguistics does is identify exactly what the legal meaning is of a document set. So we've got some case studies which are circulated on the table. And so we identify the legal meaning, and what goes into these large language models is only the output of our own Actium Archimedes robot. Then, having processed and told these models what we want at the end, we then have to iterate at the end of it, because everybody in this room would have a different interpretation of what I'm saying. So you can iterate in a boardroom or a compliance committee meeting room what these outputs actually mean to a user before they're ticked off by a senior professional to go to use. So we call this the banner, and it's a combination of technologies, and in addition, where you've got heavily contextual needs, we scour the planet for those technology companies that can provide that solution. Now, we call this the reasoning machine, and it's a combination of what's in our heads, what's on our servers, and for those that are more risk-seeking, what's on the cloud, right? Now, hitherto where we've been at, and because of the ability of these large language models to scrape and steal whatever, you're getting this issue called hallucination. And because they're not intelligent, if they don't know the answer or can't produce the answer, they make it up. So it's called hallucinating. And that's no good in a professional environment because it's fake. All right? We're all used to hearing about fake news. Well, fake output from these large language models happens all of the time. So what we have done is built this AI reasoning machine, which is heavily supervised by human beings. It's both linguistics-based and mathematically based and contextually based at your level. And that is the output that you get. And this document here, which you've got there, called The Firm of the Future, summarizes all of this. So if you just flick through to the last page, page 25, this is a real live case, and it's built on, Nate's an engineer by original profession, so you see a bit of statutory text there about the welding code. And if you put that through a large language model, it actually creates more words that have to be interpreted by a lawyer or a senior manager than the original. Right? So in that case, it creates work. If you then use the same text through the Archimedes legal linguistics model, you actually save a lot of words and therefore a lot of supervision, because that gets directly down to the legal meaning of the text. All right? So I'm around all day today and most of tomorrow. Nate's around, but these reasoning machines is the way that you need to go, and forget the sort of dinner table topic discussions about ChatGPT, because you're going to go wrong. Now, on the table, there's two recent case studies, which I'll finish up with. One, what I call the Sydney taxi case. And I got off the plane at 11 a.m. one morning in a hot box of a Sydney cab, and I had this panic call from a client of mine that was facing loss of its AFSL with a conference with ASIC at 2 that day, and it was sort of like help, Anyway, it was a classic example of regulatory overreach by the robber barons, and the confusion between what was a discretionary power and what was an absolute power. And in this case, it was quite simple in terms of the linguistics, but it was the distinction between must and may. Anyway, the conference was held, my paper was finished in the cab with relevant case materials attached to it, all in the cab. And the conference was adjourned and referred to the AAT, where the RE won the case. The second example there was completely different. And for those of you that don't know about retirement, the Queensland Retirement Villages Act is completely different from the other states. And if you're going to have one of these retirement village homes, you have to enter into 3 different contracts, which are not consistent. And in this case, there was a big battle with the auditor about whether certain liabilities were current or non-current. Anyway, I was able to use the robotics and the insights that come from that to determine the true nature of the balance sheet item in question, and write the note that the auditor then accepted and appeared in the accounts. So these are 2 recent live examples in small professional services businesses. So thank you very much, and I look forward to any chats that this might have stimulated.